and the Compass newsletter. Today, we celebrate the 100th birthday of Malcolm X. And this evening, our featured author, Mike Whitaker, will discuss his latest work on Malcolm X with our moderator, Michael Fletcher. Mark Whitaker is an author, journalist, and media executive. He is the former editor of Newsweek and the first African American to lead a national news weekly. He then served as Washington bureau chief for NBC News and managing editor of CNN Worldwide. Whitaker's memoir, My Long Trip Home, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. His social history, Smoketown, the untold story of the other great Black Renaissance, and Saying It Loud, 1966, the year Black Power changed the Civil Rights Movement, were both named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. This evening's moderator, Michael Fletcher, is a senior writer with ESPN's Enterprise Investigative Team. Before that, he wrote for ESPN's The Undefeated, focusing on politics, criminal justice, and social issues. Fletcher spent 21 years at the Washington Post, where his beats included the national economy, the White House, and race relations. He is the co-author of Supreme Discomfort, The Divided Soul of Clarence Thomas. Please join me in welcoming Mark Whitaker in conversation with Michael Fletcher to discuss Whitaker's work, The Afterlife of Malcolm X, an outcast turned icon's enduring impact on America.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out. For today, the 100th birthday of Malcolm X. I was saying to Mark backstage, I didn't realize that today was his birthday until yesterday, as I was putting my questions together for this Q&A, and it just sort of brought back so much. I did a lot of my journalism around the Nation of Islam, like some of it at least, and I'm pretty familiar with a lot of kind of the history of the nation and the conflicts with Malcolm. And before reading the book, I thought I knew a lot about this, and I did, but I learned a lot reading the book. So I just want to offer a quick plug before I start with the questions. You should buy the book because I think it's excellent, and you'll learn something. I know I did.
Thank you.
Mark, let's start at the beginning. Why Malcolm?
So, Malcolm, like a lot of people, I first discovered Malcolm myself in reading the autobiography. And I was born in 1957, so I was only 8 years old when he was assassinated. I was vaguely aware of him, but, I came from a household where, my parents were big supporters of King and sort of the, mainstream civil rights movement. So to the degree that I was aware of him at that point, it was the way he was widely seen, at the time in white America, but even in much of Black America as sort of a scary militant fringe figure. But I was deeply moved as a teenager by, as many people have been over the decades, by the autobiography. Because, whatever you think about his political views, and obviously they evolved and we can talk about that, it's this amazing personal story about someone who loses his parents when he's young, goes through these struggles in his youth, with drugs and with petty crime, goes to prison, embraces Islam in prison, comes out, cleans himself up, becomes this national figure, but very controversial. Then at the end, what would turn out to be the end of his life, he breaks and goes out on his own. So it left a mark on me. Then in 1992, when Spike Lee's movie came out, I was at Newsweek magazine, and I wrote a cover story called The Meaning of Malcolm X. And that talked about the fact that in addition to the generation that had known him when he was alive in the 60s and had been inspired by him while he was alive and then after his assassination, and I write about that in the book, the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement, the early advocates for Black studies, athletes like Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, et cetera. There was a new generation of young folks by the late 80s and early 90s who had discovered Malcolm through hip-hop, and then through the X-hats and all the merchandise, and then so forth. Anyway, so from then on, I've sort of followed everything that's been written. There have been several major biographies, struck by the fact that, going into, the current century with Black Lives Matter, Obama becoming president and writing in his memoir, Dreams from My Father, how he was influenced by Malcolm, conservatives, like your subject, Clarence Thomas, who talked about, once he became a national figure, how he had been influenced by Malcolm. And then my last book, this is my 5th book, my last book was on the birth of Black Power in 1966. And even though he had been dead for a year by 1966, what I discovered as I was working on that book is that his presence still loomed, and his absence too, over that year. And also that was the year that the autobiography came out 9 months in hardback in the fall of 1965, 9 months after he was assassinated. But then it became a bestseller and really started to be read by young people and so forth when it came out in paperback in 1966. I have an original edition of that famous thing where he's pointing the finger and so forth from that era. So that was when I was midway through writing my last book, and I said, that's my next book. I'm going to write a book about his posthumous influence.
As you write in the book, since 2012, there have been 2 major biographies of Malcolm X published, both Pulitzer Prize-winning books, major biographies. What was the gap in public understanding that you saw that you thought you could fill with your book?
So the 2 biographies, so the big books that have been written, first there's the autobiography written by Alex Haley, essentially, in cooperation with Malcolm. Although one of the controversial things about it is because Malcolm wasn't alive to see the final version, whether he necessarily would have signed off on everything that's in that book. Then there were a number of other books that had been written, but the 2 big biographies, each of which was a several decades long project for the authors. One was by an academic historian named Manning Marable that came out, I believe, in 2011. And then a book by a veteran journalist named Les Payne and his daughter that was published in 2020. One of the ironies of all 3 of those books is that none of the authors lived to see the publication of the book. So Malcolm was dead by the time his book came out. Manning Marable died 2 days before his book was published. He suffered from a rare lung disease. And Les Payne suffered a heart attack when his book was really still not even totally a book. I mean, he had done all of this reporting and a lot of writing, but it was left to his daughter and his editor to pull those together. But all 3 of those are the story of Malcolm's life. And I devote there's a whole chapter on the autobiography, how it came to be and how it's been viewed over the decades. There are substantial passages about both of the biographies. But what hadn't been written, and what my book is about, is not a story of his life, but it's the story of the influence that he has had since his assassination and death. And this year Today is his 100th birthday. This year is also the 60th anniversary of his assassination in February 1965. And what I argue in the introduction, and I hope I show in the book, is that for all that he accomplished during his life, he arguably has had an even greater influence on American culture and American history as a result of the influence that he's had in death. So as I said, it's his influence on Black power, Black arts, athletes, musicians, hip hop, conservatives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Up to the current day when, we can talk about this later, but I would argue that there's a lot to be learned about Malcolm and why he has remained so influential and why he was so inspiring to people then and to this day in terms of what we should be looking for in leadership at this current moment.
In going about reporting the book and doing your research, what would you say were the things that surprised you most, that maybe challenged your assumptions or your hypotheses going into the project?
Well, he was, I write a lot about people, particularly at the beginning of the book, some of the people who later wrote about him and sort of carried on his legacy did know him. And people who got to know him personally had a very different view of him than the public caricature at the time. And not just Black folks, but white folks, right? So his universe of white, I'm not sure he had many really close friends, intimates who were white, but he did get to know a number of white journalists quite well, enough to stay in regular touch with them, have long conversations with them, ask them their opinion, and so forth. And one of them is still alive, Peter Goldman, who's a significant figure in the book for a variety of reasons. But they also included Mike Wallace, a New York Times reporter named MS Mike Handler, a few others. And they said that once you got to know Malcolm, first of all, they were all blown away just by his sheer intelligence, but also his sense of humor, his kindness. He was personally just a very, very sort of gentle man for all of the, fieriness of his rhetoric. And you get a little bit of that in the autobiography, but it's a little different hearing that testimony from other people. I would say in terms of, there were things about his influence that certainly that I didn't know. I'm a jazz guy, honestly. I'm not necessarily, a scholar of hip hop. But there's a whole chapter on his influence on hip hop, so I really had to do a deep dive, and I know a lot more about it now. But.
Well, you kind of read like you're an expert on hip hop.
Yeah, well, thank you. little. Yeah, well, I definitely, got into it.
You mentioned how Malcolm was able to inspire people across the political spectrum. Moderates like President Obama, conservatives like Justice Thomas. You mentioned that even some people thought he could have been a communist.
Right.
So this whole spectrum is kind of covered by him. How is that possible, you think, that he could influence people in such varied camps?
Well, I think part of it had to do with the fact that he was very complicated. He was not. Even though the press tried really hard to pigeonhole him, he was at any different point he was much more complicated than he was made out to be. And then he evolved, right? So the Malcolm of the late 50s and the early 60s, when he was still with the Nation of Islam, is a very different Malcolm than the Malcolm of the last year, when he's split from the Nation of Islam. He makes pilgrimage to Mecca. He starts to, he says he meets white people with blue eyes who are actually, people of the faith and people he can relate to. So that's one answer. And I quote a number of people, the great historian C. Eric Lincoln and others in the book who basically say, you know, you can, I think Emanuel Cleaver, the former mayor of Kansas City, said Malcolm was 8 different people from who you could take 11 different messages. And part of the story of his afterlife is people fighting over, is he really a radical, a moderate, a conservative, et cetera. So I have all of that. But the other reason that I think he appealed to people across the political spectrum is that fundamentally, Malcolm's first project was not political. I mean, he had strong political views about nonviolence and about, you know, Pan-Africanism, other things we can talk about. But the thing that he stood for most of all, before any of that, was black pride, black dignity, black self-love, you know, at a time when, you know, black folks, not only was there segregation and discrimination, but, you know, in his mind, a whole way in which black folks were essentially indoctrinated, brainwashed, he would say, you know, to think less of themselves, to actually internalize a sense of inferiority. And so his first project was to make black folks, you know, shed that. And honestly, I think it's one reason why you can look at Malcolm's influence and his message and extend it to then the women's movement and the gay rights movement and so forth, because, you know, in all of those areas, that was part of the project. So, so both, specifically, you want to talk about Obama and Justice Thomas. Both of them talk about, at a young formative age, just being moved by Malcolm's emphasis on personal dignity and self-reliance and self-mastery, right? Which, you know, both of them, as they were kind of struggling with their own sort of sense of identity and how they were going to make the way in the world, was very powerful for them.
You know, talking about that, some people would say that Louis Farrakhan offers a similar message, and in the book you take issue with a lot of that. Compare the appeal of the two men.
Well, Louis Farrakhan, I get into this. I mean, not everybody knows the story. So, and again, I mean, I knew a little bit of this, but it was I learned more about it. There was not a direct line from Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam to Louis Farrakhan. What actually happened was, by the time Elijah Muhammad died in the 80s, sorry, the 70s, the mid-70s, his son, so what had been the Nation of Islam was taken over by his son Wallace. And Wallace, who had actually become disenchanted with his dad for various reasons, very quickly moved to distance the movement. He changed the name. He pushed it towards the more sort of orthodox international form of Islam. Publicly, you know, apologized for his father's adultery. He had gotten all of these assistants pregnant. Also tried to sort of rein in the Fruit of Islam, who were the security forces. And so, but then Farrakhan, who had been the minister in Boston while Malcolm was alive and running the mosque in New York, and initially had been sort of a protege of Malcolm's. After Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, had this ugly split, he very much sided with Elijah Muhammad and wrote things in Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper, that were very critical of Malcolm. There's a whole question of whether he knew about the assassination attempt, might have been in on it in some way. We can talk about that later. But he sort of lays low for a few years, and then he sort of resurfaces to reconstitute the Nation of Islam, right? So it is true, and I write about this in the book, it is true that Farrakhan did by the time he sort of became a national figure in his own right, so this is, by the 80s and 90s, the period leading up to the Million Man March, which, got all that attention, he is talking about self-help, self-reliance, black businesses, cleaning yourself up, all of these messages that were familiar from the earlier incarnation. But I say that I don't think he ever rivaled Malcolm, even the influence that Malcolm had when he was a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Because even though he could give a very impassioned speech, and he was a calypso singer. He was actually, there were a couple of famous records that he cut, so he had a very distinctive voice. I don't think he rivaled. It was hard to Malcolm just as a speaker, right? And then the other thing, which is much more complicated, but I do get into a little bit, is there was much more evidence. So there are people who say you can go back and listen to Malcolm's speeches and so forth and detect a strain of anti-Semitism. And it is true that Malcolm, particularly in his Nation of Islam phase, was critical of Jewish business owners in black communities. He was critical of Israel and a supporter of the Palestinian rights on the world stage. However, first of all, if you listen to what he said, he had a sophisticated argument for both of those positions, but on a personal level, and this is something that was clear from my research, he had, again, they weren't necessarily friends, but all of these journalists who he became close to were all Jewish, right? And they definitely did not feel that on a personal level they've sensed any anti-Semitism from him. And also he said a lot about how he admired Jews in America for, despite the discrimination that they faced, using their, ability to form businesses and so forth to, to establish a position of strength within the society. Farrakhan, on the other hand, was an anti-Semite. I mean, it was absolutely clear from his rhetoric. He was challenged on it. He never apologized. He said all these things. And I think it got in the way. I mean, it was so pronounced that I think it got in the way of his having, in any way, rivaling the influence that Malcolm had had.
You spent a fair amount of time in the book sort of going through the tensions between Malcolm and the nation that led up to his assassination. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a question a lot of people have. Do you think there was any government complicity in the assassination?
Yeah, so about a third of my book, and it was a little, I wanted to write the story about his influence, but around the time that I committed to writing this book, the case of the men who had been convicted for his murder, there were 3 men, 2 of them were innocent, and over the decades, more and more evidence had surfaced that they were innocent. But it took until 2020 for the New York District Attorney to actually agree to reopen the case and reinvestigate it. And it resulted in 2021, a year and a half later, in their official exoneration, a $36 million settlement with the state and city of New York for the 2 men. Only one of them was still alive. So I knew that I also wanted to tell that story, which is a bit of a kind of a murder mystery story. And so part of my challenge as a writer was to figure out how to write the book in a way that I could kind of, I could do both. But what happened was, so 3 men were convicted. One of them was guilty, was in on the original hit. He came from Paterson, New Jersey. His name was Talmage Hayer. All these guys later in prison embraced Islam and changed their names, but his name was Talmage Hayer. There were 2 other men who came from the Harlem Mosque who were arrested and convicted, but had nothing to do with it. during the trial in 1966, Hayer tried to changed his testimony in the middle of the trial to say these other guys are innocent. But when pressed on the stand to identify the people who were his accomplice, he refused to do that. So the jury didn't buy it, and they convicted all three men. A decade later, by the late 70s, as a result of further affidavits that had been signed by Hayer and other reporting that had been done by William Kunstler, the famous radical lawyer in the Chicago 7 trial, but also Peter Goldman, who's one of these journalists, who's a figure in my book. It pretty, you would have thought, conclusive evidence had emerged that actually all of the men, that there were 5 people involved in the hit, all 5 of them came out of the mosques in New Jersey, Newark and Patterson. But despite of all this evidence that, was pretty solid by then, Kunstler and Goldman, who tried to get the, authorities at the time to reopen the case, were unsuccessful. They just, so they stayed in jail until they were eligible for parole. Eventually they got out. And it took until, 2020, largely as a result of a documentary that was made for the Fusion channel, but then aired on Netflix, reached a wide audience on Netflix, in which the filmmakers went in search of the man who had actually shot Malcolm dead with a shotgun, the kill shot to his chest in the Audubon Ballroom. He had gone to prison briefly for other crimes, armed robbery, but had gotten out, was alive, and a sort of a pretty significant, well-known figure in Newark. Everybody in Newark knew that he had done it, but they didn't really care or didn't.
He kind of like a pillar? And
he was, and honestly, a lot of the people there who, even if they had left the nation, they were of the thinking at the time that Malcolm was a traitor for having left and turned against Elijah Muhammad. So they weren't particularly big supporters of Malcolm. Anyway, but then just as the filmmakers were going to confront him with all this evidence of his past, he had changed his name, he died, and they ended up focusing more on the 2 men who had been wrongfully convicted. So it's a long-winded answer to say it's pretty clear, we know now, who carried out the assassination. 5 men, gunmen from New Jersey. Then the question becomes, who else knew about it? Were they acting on their own? Were they acting at the direction of the minister in Newark, or even Chicago, Elijah Muhammad, headquarters, NOI? 1. And then 2, clearly we also know that Malcolm was being heavily surveilled by the New York Police Department, the intelligence wing of the New York Police Department, the FBI, and the CIA. So were any of them involved? And anyway, so the answer to that is we don't know. We do know he was left largely unprotected. There's some evidence on the day of the murder. There's some evidence that he actually didn't want a big uniform police imprint at the Audubon Ballroom because it would have scared away followers. What we do know is, and part of the settlement that was eventually reached, by the way, in the exoneration, was also compensation for the fact that the NYPD did know a lot about the threats on his life and had, even if he, partly at his request, had left him insufficiently protected. That was part of the basis of the financial settlement. But what is really interesting and still unresolved is that the FBI, and again, another thing, sort of misconception that people have sometimes when they talk about these government agencies is that they were all operating in cahoots, right? As though, you know, if FBI agents, CIA agents, and police were all sort of in a room talking to each other. In fact, it was the opposite. They were hiding information from each other. They were not getting along, right? It's like that joke about the Army and the Navy, like our real enemy isn't the Soviets, it's the Navy, right? That's the way. But so what we now know is that within days and weeks after the assassination, there was all this communication within the FBI about the gunman having come from New Jersey and not from New York, right? At a time when the NYPD was building a case that it had been done out of New York. And that intelligence by the FBI was never shared with the NYPD or with the prosecutors who brought the case. So a year later, they bring a case which is entirely based on the theory that this was a hit organized out of the mosque in New York. Again, sort of implausibly that the three gunmen just decided to do it on their own at nobody's direction. But meanwhile, the FBI has all this evidence that in fact the gunmen were from New Jersey that they never shared. So the most benign, and it's not benign at all, but you know, interpretation of that is that they had all these informants, that some of the gunmen, and perhaps even the shotgun dude, as the current mayor of Newark, Ross Baraka calls him, was an FBI informant, and they were just protecting the identity of informants. You know, the more damning possibility is that, you know, they had been tipped off, that they knew that, and so forth. I personally find it a little bit hard to believe that anybody, you know, clearly they had informants, but I don't think even, you know, informants within the Nation of Islam, and there were also informants who were in Malcolm's camp. There was a guy named Gene Roberts who was a bodyguard who was there the day of the assassination, actually tried to give Malcolm mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He was on the payroll of the NYPD. So they had informants, but I'm not sure that even the informants completely trusted them, right? The cops and the FBI didn't trust them, you know, et cetera. So, but we don't know, but interestingly, and perhaps tellingly, the lawyers who brought the lawsuits, who represented Muhammad Aziz, the one wrongfully convicted man who was still alive, and the family of the other one who had died by the time they were exonerated, after getting this exoneration at the state and local level and winning a $36 million settlement, turned around and tried to sue the federal government, partly for more money, but also to get more information about what the FBI knew, and the federal government moved to shut it down. And they're still doing that. So I think my guess is that there's more that hasn't come out that would really make the FBI look bad.
You mentioned in the book, and just now, as a matter of fact, that Malcolm's presence was everywhere, as you did your 1966 book, a year after his assassination. But in the book, you write also that his popularity has kind of ebbed and flowed, his afterlife, if you will, has ebbed and flowed through the years. Talk about that a little bit. What sort of rekindled interest in Malcolm as, you know, say in the 70s or the early 80s, and how has that kind of affected how the world sees him?
So I think the interesting thing about that is that, you know, when you think about Dr. King, first of all, you know, it's interesting to go back. I write about just how the New York Times, as an example, covered their two assassinations, right? They were both 39 when they died. Malcolm's assassination made the front page, but it was a single column story in the middle of the front page, where he was described in the lead as the leader of a militant sect. Whereas Dr. King, 3 years later, there was a two-column banner headline, the kind of headline you only see with like presidential elections and, you know, moon landings and so forth. You know, he was, you know, at the time, you know, there was a real disparity in terms of just the stature that they had. But unlike Dr. King, who, you know, I think for a whole variety of reasons, there has been ever since a desire on the part not just of black folks, but of sort of the white establishment, if you can call it that, to hold him up, give him a national holiday, you know, sort of every year remind everybody of the I Have a Dream speech and so forth, turn to Dr. King as representing this kind of great hope for racial reconciliation and, you know, and so forth. Malcolm's legacy has been kept alive by young people, right? It started with the Black Power generation at a time when they were challenging the civil rights movement, as I write about in my previous book. Then, just as they were kind of aging out a little bit, just in terms of their influence, but also no longer being young and so forth, the hip-hop generation comes along, and they embrace him, right? And they didn't do that because actually he wasn't even being taught in the history books at that point. But where they discovered him actually was that albums, old vinyl albums, had been made of his speeches. And they like circulated, right? And if you kind of knew where to find them, and people, they were so struck, this is, you know, 20 years later after his assassination, just by the power of his voice when you heard it on a record, that these young people who were creating this new form of hip hop, like immediately it kind of rang, it jibed with them in terms of the sound of this new music that they were creating, so they started to sample him, right? And you know, it started with actually a white rapper and drummer who was a session drummer for Sugar Hill Records named Keith LeBlanc, who produced a record called Malcolm X No Sellout, which was just clips of his speeches with, like, you know, a beatbox, you know, beat behind it. And then Public Enemy comes along and they start sampling his speeches, and KRS-One and Tupac comes along and is sampling him and writing lyrics about him and so forth. And then Spike Lee, who was in his early 30s, I mean, Spike Lee was still a relative kid by Hollywood standards when he, you know, this idea of making a biopic about Malcolm had been floating around, you know, since the 60s, and it had been revived, and the job had been assigned to a very distinguished white filmmaker, older white filmmaker named Norman Jewison, who had done these, you know, very well-known movies about racial issues, In the Heat of the Night, Soldier Story. Spike didn't care. Spike's idea was like, nope, Malcolm's story has to be told by a black director, and I'm only 30 or 31, whatever he was, but I'm the man to do it. And he went after it, and he you know, and mounted a public campaign until Jewison stood aside and let him. And then, you know, yet again in recent years, the Black Lives Matter generation, when an opera, I spent a few pages at the end of the book talking about the opera that was composed about Malcolm X by the great black composer Anthony Davis in the 80s, and his brother and cousin, was revived in 2021, first in Detroit, and then made it all the way to the Metropolitan Opera in New York, but with an Afrofuturist staging. Costumes and like a spaceship on the stage and so forth and so on. So there's this whole generation that's into Afrofuturism and the Black Panther and so forth. Like, they were just rediscovering Malcolm through that. So
his culture kept him alive?
I think that is, yeah, we were talking about that backstage. So I think this is a really important point. Another thing that I think differentiates Malcolm from Dr. King and a lot of the other civil rights movements is we associate them primarily with a sort of a political message, right? An opposition to Jim Crow, pro-voting rights, nonviolence, et cetera, political change, social change. Malcolm eventually got involved in that debate. He gave after leaving the Nation of Islam, he gave a famous speech called The Ballot or the Bullet, which he was partly an answer to people who said that by any means necessary was just a call to violence. He was saying, actually, if we can get our rights through the voting booth, that's better. It's only if we can't that we might have to think about more extreme measures. But before that, even higher on his hierarchy of concerns was culture, right? And the idea not just of black pride and black self-respect, but know your history. This is why the founders, a lot of the early advocates of black studies consider him in some ways the father of black studies because of his emphasis. Also black art. It's why, poets from Amira Baraka to Maya Angelou to jazz musicians like John Coltrane, and then later, the hip-hop generation, people who were, much more focused on sort of cultural, a message than a political message, consider him such a hero. And I've been thinking about this. I was telling Michael, I've been thinking about this recently in terms of, if we want to start tying this to what's going on today. When you look at, first of all, I think, when you talk about Malcolm and Martin and Dr. King, part of their influence kind of ebbs and flows depending on whether we're in a period of racial progress or racial, backtracking and backlash. And one of the things that's kept Malcolm alive too is that every time there's progress, there's backlash, right? And so we're in another of those periods. I think we can all agree at this point. When you think about what would Malcolm say today, he wouldn't be surprised, honestly, about, because he was tough on white racism, but he was also tough on white liberals who he thought weren't necessarily always there in the clutch, So to the degree that you now see people retreating from some of the commitments that they made on DEI and other things, as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, that would be predictable as far as he was concerned. But for all of that, when you look at what's going on right now, you look at the attacks on DEI, Black Studies, the African American History Museum in Washington, iconic figures like Jackie Robinson. You know who this current administration has not gone after? Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl. Ryan Coogler and Sinners, breaking box office records. So there's some level on which even this administration realizes that there is a cultural power that black folks have now that is actually so strong that it cannot be brought down, right? And so the flip side of that is, what does resistance look like in this day and age? I think one answer is it's not just political, it's cultural. Or certainly I think that's a message that Malcolm would stand for and that you can read into his legacy right now.
This will be my last question before I throw it to the audience here. As you think about Malcolm, how do you see him? Is he a figure of transformation in your mind, one of some with anger, that the way some people think of him, or hope? I mean, how do you?
So you go back. It's really interesting. So Malcolm was put on the map, really, the national map, more than anything, by a documentary that was made in 1959 by a young Mike Wallace called The Hate That Hate Produced. And it aired on local television in New York, first in segments and then in its entirety. And it really introduced the Nation of Islam itself and Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, I think, to a more national audience in a way that it never had before. And so Mike, the person he sort of teamed up with to make this documentary was a black journalist named Louis Lomax. And at the time, Wallace was he later got to know Malcolm and they actually sort of became friends, but at the time he had never met him and he didn't even interview him for this. Louis Lomax did all the interviews for this documentary that was narrated by Wallace. And so this is 1959. This is 4 years before, 6 years before his assassination and 5 years before he even leaves the Nation of Islam. And Louis Lomax is saying to him, people say you stand for hate and violence. And Malcolm just in this way that Malcolm had, because people thought that he was this firebrand, but when he spoke, he spoke in this very direct, kind of calm way, which was part of what was so disarming about him, right? And he said no. He said what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad just teaches black people to love themselves. We're a religion of love. We're a movement of love, right? And I think that continued to be true. I think his greatest concern was to help black people love themselves, including the people who are hurting the most, right? In the inner cities, right? People who were on drugs, people who had been in prison, people who were really looked down upon, not the talented 10th, like black folks that, white people wanted to integrate with. These were the black folks that white people had no interest in integrating with them. But Malcolm said to them, you are just as worthy as anybody, right? He even said during his lifetime about the whole sort of integration, affirmative action didn't really exist as a term, but he said, I'm not interested in talking about integration until white folks want to integrate with all of us and not just with, some of us, right? I personally, that's what I think about at the end of the day. That was his most important message. It wasn't a message of hatred or violence. It was actually the opposite. It was a message of love.
Yeah, at this point, if anyone has questions, please line up at either microphone to...
About 15 minutes for your questions. Again, as Michael just mentioned, either mic will suffice. I'm going to sneak in a question from the folks watching at home right now while all of you come up to the microphone. I know you will. Can you talk about the impact of the autobiography of Malcolm X and Malcolm's working relationship with Alex Haley?
Yeah, so it's a really, as I said, there's a whole chapter about it. Alex Haley is a really interesting character in his own right. He was sort of politically a moderate Republican, which a lot of black folks were those days. He had served in the Coast Guard for 20 years. He had a whole first career. But he was always interested in writing. So even while he was in the Coast Guard, he started out writing love letters. He would, like Cyrano for other people who he was serving with. And then, he actually got a post as the chief journalist for the Coast Guard before he took his pension. And then he wanted to write, and but as a black author at that freelance journalist at that point, he had to pitch stories to various publications. So he pitched a story about the Nation of Islam, which was then really just fledgling, to Reader's Digest. And so he wrote a piece first for Reader's Digest, and a few years later he wrote another piece for the Saturday Evening Post. And then he he got an assignment to do the first Playboy interview, if you remember those, with Miles Davis. And after that appeared, he was thinking, who else could I do a long-form interview with? And he thought of Malcolm, and he approached it, and there was negotiations involved. Finally, Malcolm agrees. And so this long, 6-7 page Playboy interview appears, and that was the thing that caught the interest of the publishing industry. So the head of Doubleday, which was then the largest publishing house in the country, read this and thought, I think this guy might have an autobiography in him, right? And so he talked to Haley about it. Haley was obviously interested. He's an ambitious guy. He had to approach Malcolm, who was originally skeptical, and made him go all the way to Chicago and get the blessing of Elijah Muhammad. But eventually they agree. They sign a deal. There's an advance and so forth. But even then, they set up a schedule where Haley is going to go Malcolm is going to go after doing everything else he has to do all day to meet Haley at his small apartment in Greenwich Village so that they can, he can start telling his life story, although initially he doesn't want to tell his life story. He just wants to sort of, preach the gospel according to Elijah Muhammad. And so there's this long period and a lot of sort of, psychological gamesmanship, but by which Haley finally gets Malcolm to start getting personal, right? And that becomes the basis of the book. But there was one of the reasons, Haley, we definitely owe Haley a debt for having seen that the book would be a much better book and a much more lasting book if it was a personal story, right? Which was what Malcolm resisted at first. But there are people who to this day and for decades afterwards thought that Haley, partly because of his own politics, but also because by the time he finished the book, Malcolm wasn't around to say any different, paints a portrait of him, particularly at the end of his life, as becoming perhaps more moderate than in fact he really ever became. He clearly evolved, but there's a lot of evidence, and this is largely the argument in the Manning Marable biography, that if you look closely, Malcolm was, he met with King once in his final year. He said, for the first time, he said some nice things about Dr. King. Dr. King said some nice things about him. There is some evidence, perhaps, that had Malcolm lived, that they might have cooperated on certain things. But what Malcolm was really focused on in that last year was trying to create an alliance between people fighting for racial justice in America and around the world, what we now call Pan-Africanism, right? That is absolutely clear that that's something that he was aiming for. So there's no question that the autobiography is a big part of the story, but there's no way that you can really understand who Malcolm was, what his message really was, or the full extent of his influence just through the autobiography. It's only part of the story.
So we have time for these 3 questions, 2 on this side, 1 on this side. Let's start over there.
Hello, sir. I have a question. Well, of course I have a question, duh. Sorry. Your book came out in 2025. His wife passed in 1997. When you started your journey of writing your book, did you get his family blessing? Did you interact with his daughters or his grandchildren to get more insight from?
So they were aware. I was in indirect contact with Ilyasa, who's probably the most public of his daughters and kind of represents the family in a lot of things. It was sort of clear to me that, first of all, I do talk a little bit. I didn't really want to get that deeply into their personal lives. I do talk about, sadly, the way in which Betty Shabazz died and, how first she, developed her own career, both in education and as an activist in her own right, and was a gatekeeper in many ways. I don't think the whole hip-hop thing would have happened without her blessing. They came to her and asked for her permission to do that. I write about all of that. I didn't want to get deeply into her personal life or their personal life, so I didn't really need them for the story. I offered to talk to them. It was clear, came back from Ilyasa, that she was aware. They weren't going to do anything to stop me, but they didn't seem all that eager to necessarily talk to me either. And so, but that was okay with me, you know. But you know, they're definitely aware, and I certainly haven't heard anything negative from them. And you know, they're very. It's a little complicated right now. They have their own publishing projects and other projects, but the main thing is that they've instituted a new lawsuit against the federal government. They're being represented by Ben Crump. They've made there's been a lot of attention paid to it. So I think the main thing that they didn't want to do was anything that would interfere with that lawsuit. So.
I had a question about him traveling to Mecca or to the Middle East, and once he saw white folks with blue eyes, did that change his view on how he looked at white folks?
Yeah, no question. He came back from that trip and explicitly said that. He said it in a letter, a famous letter that he wrote that was leaked to the New York Times, and that is now, you can see it, it's at the Schomburg Center. But then also he publicly said this at a press conference when he went back. And what he said was, you know, he went there for the first time, and he said he prayed with, he ate with, he saw people. Now, they were all Muslims, but they came from all over the world and of different colors and so forth. So that made him realize that race, to the degree that there was a struggle between good and evil in the world, it wasn't just purely based on race. It was based on other things. And another thing that he explicitly said, in fact, in the last speech that he finished 3 days before he was killed at Barnard College, the women's college in New York City, to an almost almost exclusively, I'm sure there were some black students there, but almost entirely white audience, you know, a majority of them female, some Columbia students had come, faculty, and so forth. He explicitly said in that speech, I'm not here to talk about a racial struggle, I'm here to talk about a global human rights struggle, and who's on the right side and the wrong side of that global human rights struggle. So that's really the framework that he had at the end of his life.
We have time for 3 more questions, that one, and then 2 here.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation of your book. I'm kind of piggybacking on some of the comments a little bit earlier. I think Malcolm went to Mecca in 1959 for Elijah Muhammad so that he could do the Hajj,
Right.
I think.
Yeah, there was an exploratory thing. I don't know whether he was sort of reconnoitering as opposed to sort of fully doing the whole experience in the way that he did, yeah.
I meant to say Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that Iran came out with a Malcolm X stamp before the United States. And could you speak a little to that?
So he definitely is, he is a huge figure
influence?
around the world. I mean, for a variety of reasons, and you could, in fact, books have been written, and you could write a whole book, and I think there are more other people who I know are working on them, that is just about the international Malcolm. I sort of chose, I talk about this international appeal that he had and the international frame of reference. I don't go into great depth about how he was covered and embraced around the world, just because I had so much other ground to cover in terms of his influence here on America. But there's no question, and I think to this day, you know, I'm sure tomorrow you could probably do a roundup of all the coverage that his 100th birthday is getting today around the world, and it would be extensive. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chantal Nubia Faulkner. First, it's an honor to meet you. I am the president of the Lexington Market Merchant Association. I'm also a merchant there, which is called Crowns of Nubia. My son, he is Malcolm's namesake. His name is Malik S Jones. And I grew up in the Nation of Islam, and his father, who was also in the Nation of Islam, happens to be from Boston, Massachusetts. Yeah. First, I would like to ask if you would be open to accept the invitation of coming to Lexington Market with your book and doing a book signing. Like you said, I think Malcolm's main concern was our youth, as well as people our age, to know about history. And one of the things I'm trying to do is bring different authors to Lexington Market, which is the heart of the city, so that it'd be an opportunity for our people as well as other races to be more informed with our culture as well as issues that we go through as a people. So I did not even know that you were going to be here today, and the universe don't make mistakes. So your book is not in my, it's not in my economical forte today. However, I would like to invite you. Second, oh God, no. Second, oh yeah, what do you think about maybe doing a tour to the multiple HBCUs here in the United States so that you can inform them? Because two books that I have used with my son, he's 20 now, he goes to Micah, but that I have used as, in my mind, storytelling books was another book by Anthony Browder, but also the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I think it's very important from your perspective, you know, for the students at the HBCUs to be informed with your outlook of Malcolm. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm going back to New York tomorrow. I'm giving a talk at the Schomburg Center tomorrow evening. But I will. I'm going to stay, and anybody who wants to buy a book, I'm happy to sign it. But why don't you give me your information? I'll give you my information. We can stay in touch, and maybe we can figure out some time when I could do that. Yes. Yeah.
Last question.
Thank you for your contribution, and thank the audience and those who organized this. My name is Jimmy Taylor. I'm a physician who first got interested in Malcolm X on a day when I was gathering freshman books in the college bookstore and didn't have enough money, and there was this spiral thing with the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Yep.
And that rounded out my purchases. Went home and read it in about 2 days. But to get to my question, with respect to the issue of reparations, can you infer what Malcolm and perhaps most enlightened economists would put forth today in the spirit of, as I see it, reparations granted or seized by whatever means necessary?
Yeah. Right. I see what you're saying. No, so there's no question that he talked about theft. First of all, that he was focused on economic self-determination for black people, in addition to political, that was always part of his message. There was no question that he believed that there had been, black folks had been cheated, not only by being, the lack of, everything that came with slavery, but then the promises that were made, after the Civil War. He talked about all of that. He talked about that as being part of the history that needed to be taught. And so, I'm a little reluctant. I'm just, it's my training as a journalist to not, say that I can say exactly what positions Malcolm would take today. But I think there's a lot of evidence just in what he said at the time that certainly he felt like black folks were due. On the other hand, he was also skeptical about what you could ultimately expect white folks to give up, right? So I don't think that he ever thought that it was something that, would get very far if it depended on the charity of white folks, right? It's really interesting. I'll just say, by the way, if you want to check it out, I did a piece. I do occasional stories for CBS Sunday Morning. I don't know if you know about that show, but and I did a piece 3 years ago, I think, on reparations, on the whole reparations debate, at a time when it's never gotten that far, but where certainly it seemed like it had gotten further than anybody ever expected. And I talked to Cory Booker, who had had a proposal that was had been presented, or he was working on in Congress, and so forth. There were a few local communities and cities around the country that were starting on their own to have reparations projects. But just this is one of the things that's under attack now. So to the degree that there was some progress on that front, everybody's in retreat from it now. So whether it resurfaces and gains some more momentum again at some point, but it is I think it's a very, very deep subject because, so much of what constitutes power in this country comes from money. And not just at the corporate level, at the individual level and at the community level and at the resources that people have to educate their children, right? And the impact of the disadvantages that black folks have had over the decades and centuries, starting with slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, housing discrimination, you name it, it's cumulative. Right? And so even if we're in a period where there doesn't seem to be that much appetite for reaching into people's pockets to pay for the past, we at least have to have the recognition going forward that that's the case, right? And that whatever disadvantages today exist economically in this country, in terms of, jobs, opportunity, education, and so forth, as long as they persist, will continue to have a cumulative effect going into the future.
You have to wrap up. I'm sorry. Yeah. It'll be quick. I did hear a question.
Very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did hear a question in your response when you said right, followed by question mark. So
that's just a annoying
I understand
rhetorical thing that all these people who
I'm trying to invoke the spirit of Malcolm.
Yeah.
And there was the word seizure of reparations in my question. And granted, it's a question.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, okay. No, that's, well, what would you seize? I mean, I get it, and we can have a discussion offline about it. I don't know. I mean, it's a complicated thing because that could be interpreted a lot of different ways, and has been. There back in the 60s, people were, breaking into places and, and taking money as kind of, righteous seizure and so forth. So it could take form. So Why don't we
No.
talk about that offline? Because
But I must say, I have nothing to do with breaking into
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say that the U.S. economy appears to be somewhat tottering. The reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, I hear from people who know more than me, is under attack. And I see it like one of those slave ships in the middle of the ocean that needs all the occupants to not go down,
Yeah.
regardless of which shore it
Yeah,
turns.
that I agree with. That I agree with.
Excuse me for
No, it's fine. So as I said, I'm going to stick around. I'm going to sign books for anybody who wants to buy a book, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with you then.
Please help. Please help me to thank this evening's moderator, Michael Fletcher. And this evening's author, Mark Whitaker. As Mark just mentioned, he'd be happy to talk some more, sign your book that you're going to purchase from Ivy Bookshop, and we'll see you outside in about 5 minutes. Thank you.